Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us from legacy to legislation, unpacking Arizona's housing crisis and charting policy solutions. I'm Nicole Rodriguez, president of the Urban Phoenix Project, and I'm honored to be your host for today's important discussion. Housing affordability and accessibility are critical issues shaping Arizona's future. As our state continues to grow, we must ensure that our policies and development strategies evolve to meet the needs of our communities. Today's conversation will explore how historical decisions have shaped our current housing landscape, and more importantly, the legislative solutions that can move us forward. About Urban Phoenix Project, before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the organization behind today's event. The Urban Phoenix Project is a nonprofit dedicated to making Phoenix a more sustainable, livable, and inclusive city. While our primary focus is on Phoenix, we know that housing challenges extend across Arizona with policies and market forces shaping our shared future. That's why we're committed to advocating for housing affordability, smart growth, and equitable urban development, not just for our city, but for the community statewide. This conversation is an important step in understanding the root causes of Arizona's housing crisis and the paths we can take to address it. And an event like this doesn't come together on its own. As a volunteer-run nonprofit, we heavily rely on the dedication and hard work of our board members and volunteers to support our mission. I'd like to give a special thank you to our board member, Dennis Truffin, who made sure all the logistics of this webinar came together smoothly and will be assisting with any technical issues throughout the session. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our vice chair, Kristen Hegley, who set up the event page and helped ensure that we could bring this conversation to you today. Their hard work and efforts of all our volunteers make events like this possible, and we are incredibly grateful for their contributions. So now let's turn our attention to our distinguished guest speakers, who will provide expert insights into Arizona's housing crisis and the policy solutions being considered to address it. First, I'd like to introduce Kirin Goff, Executive Director of the Arizona Neighborhood Project. Kirin is a policy nerd, lawyer, and native Phoenix native, excuse me. She developed a passion for housing and land use policy through her work in public health. Her first job after law school was drafting health regulations at the Arizona Department of Health Services. And for several years, she studied how the built environment impacts issues like heat-related deaths, social isolation, exercise, and homelessness as an assistant professor of practice at the University of Arizona. In 2023, Kirin started volunteering her time and expertise with the Arizona Neighborhood Project out of a desire to not just study, but actually enact good housing policy and land use policies. In 2024, after seeing firsthand the potential to improve the lives of Arizonans, he stepped up as A&P's executive director. In this role, Kirin leads the development of A&P's policy priorities, drafts bills, and interfaces with policy experts, housing advocates, civic groups, and policymakers from across the state. She loves building relationships and does not shy away from tough conversations. Next, I'm honored to introduce State Representative Sarah Ligouri. Sarah Ligouri is a proud Arizona native with a career rooted in real estate, finance, and public service. Born and raised in Tucson, she began her professional journey in rural land development and commercial brokerage before transitioning to financial planning, where she spent a decade helping families and small businesses achieve their goals. Beyond her professional work, Sarah has dedicated her personal life to serving the community. She has provided leadership on advisory boards for organizations such as the Urban Land Institute, BMO Harris Bank, and ROA, I hope I got that correct, as well as through her volunteer efforts in youth mentorship, homelessness prevention, and expanding opportunities for underserved communities. Sarah was appointed to the Arizona State Legislature for District 5 and served in 2022 and in 2024 returning for another term in 2025. During her tenure, she has prioritized housing, water conservation, reproductive rights, education, healthcare, and economic equity. Her legislative work includes championing bills to expand affordable housing solutions, such as ADUs, middle housing, and mobile home park protections, and advancing water conservation efforts, including securing $200 million and statewide funding for conservation projects. Previously, Sarah led the Impact Investing program at the Arizona Community Foundation, overseeing initiatives to expand affordable housing and provide nonprofits with access to low-cost capital. Today, she consults on housing, environmental, and economic equity issues while embracing her most cherished role as a mother of 2 young children. So as you can see, both of our speakers bring deep expertise and passion to this issue. But why is this conversation so important right now? Arizona's housing crisis didn't happen overnight. It is the result of decades of policy choices, economic shifts, and development patterns that have shaped where and how we live. But today isn't just about understanding the past, it's about looking forward. What policies can make housing more affordable? How can we ensure that our growth is sustainable and inclusive? These are the critical questions we'll explore today. And I encourage all of you to listen, engage, and think about how these policy solutions shape the future of Arizona's housing landscape. So what to expect today is the way that the webinar will flow is we'll start with insights from our speakers as they break down Arizona's housing challenges and political solutions. After the presentation, we'll move into a Q&A session. And I encourage you to drop your questions in the chat at any time. We'll be tracking them throughout the session, and we'll have time at the end to address as many as possible. And lastly, before we dive in, Urban Phoenix Project relies on donations and contributions from supporters like you. If you believe in the work we are doing and want to help us continue promoting and educating for better housing policies and urban development in Phoenix, I encourage you to visit our website and consider making a donation. Every contribution, big or small, helps. So thank you for that. So now let's get started. First, I'd like to welcome Kirin Goff, Executive Director of the Arizona Neighborhood Project, to provide an overview of Arizona's evolving housing landscape. Kirin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Trying to go to the next slide. Great. Great to meet everybody. First, just a couple words about Arizona Neighborhood Project, which shout out to Nicole, because not only is she a part of Urban Phoenix Project, but she's also a part of Arizona Neighborhood Project. We were all volunteer until June, other than our lobbyists, when I came on as executive director. And we've been focusing on, so far, state level housing legislation, and now we're doing more city work. But we have been focusing primarily at kind of getting at the root causes of why our housing market is broken, so that we can avoid layering complex solutions on top of broken systems. So far what that's looked like is looking fairly narrowly at reforming things like zoning codes and building codes. And in addition to being able to look at the root causes, this approach has helped us to build a bipartisan coalition, focusing on places where people across the political spectrum can agree. So we'll talk today about some bills that ANP has championed and supported, but I do feel the need to say opinions are my own. Not everything I say is necessarily representative of our organization as a whole. So we will start by talking about kind of the status quo of how our housing market is broken and where it's at. Then we'll talk a little bit about the sort of history and how we got here. And then we'll go into some legislation that's actually currently proposed or recently passed. And we'll try not to take too much time with the actual presentation part, because we want to have lots of time at the end for questions and discussion. So I will kick it off to, I'll go first with, is it going? It's supposed to go to the next slide automatically when okay. So what is wrong with our housing market? So just big picture, and then Sarah will go into kind of some of the data. So we have a shortage of housing. So we know that we don't have enough homes overall for everybody who lives here and is moving here. And as part of that, prices increase when you have a shortage of something. But we also have a tremendous mismatch between supply and demand in terms of the types of housing that are available. The market is very dominated by really only two products, both of which are fairly expensive, which is your kind of large houses on large lots and apartments, most of which newly being constructed or sort of mid-rise apartments built by large developers. And there's actually quite a bit of housing in between. And household size has actually decreased quite a bit over time. And yet the average house size has increased tremendously. The average new house is 2,500 square feet, but well above half of households actually have 2 or fewer people in them. And so in addition to addressing the cost of housing, we would like to make it so that folks have more control over their own lives and are able to make choices in terms of where they want to live and how they want to make trade-offs related to all the different types of housing. So I'll kick it off to Sarah to dive into some of the data about specifically where the housing market is at.
Thanks, Kirin. And just a couple pieces we'll throw a lot of data at you and go through this pretty quickly in hopes to get to your questions. On that last slide, Kirin, if you don't mind putting that back up, I'll just kind of give perspective into the numbers of where we are. So Arizona, we have had the 4th most undersupplied market in the United States for the past 4 years. We've heard the numbers of anywhere between 90,000 and 270,000 homes we are short, which for this, in context for this group, if there's 20 of us here, imagine that there's only 14 chairs for us to play a game of musical chairs with. That is essentially what the housing crisis is in Arizona right now. There's not enough chairs for all the demand we are getting in. And that's led to high prices. In 10 years, home prices have doubled 2.5 times. I've seen that in homes that I have rented and purchased throughout the years. And our rent has increased 70% in Metro Phoenix from 2017 to 2022. And Maricopa County remains the number one in the top 5 spot for places to relocate. So just really want to reiterate that with 200 people at a peak moving into Maricopa County every day, we haven't had enough homes for all of those, which has raised the prices of homes. And as Kirin mentioned, a lot of what's coming online is it fits in 2 categories and is for the most part dominated by rentals. So just wanted to give you some data on the background there. Like that just sets the stage for the crisis we're in and the prices we're seeing. So here's some more information on what we're looking at. And this is from 2023. So I'm assuming prices have gone up a little bit since we last updated this slide with the data, but you can see there how rents have increased in some of the cities we're in. I moved to Phoenix 18 years ago, and I've lived in our district in the central Phoenix area in the entire 18 years I've been here. I paid $800 a month for an 800 square foot casita and walking distance to the Biltmore. That was affordability, during that time frame, pre-pandemic, 8 or 9 years ago. And then we have 2023 and 2024. We've seen the highest years of evictions on record for Maricopa County. And so what we're seeing right now is that we've had a complete inverse where, when I was living in Phoenix pre-pandemic, you could find plenty of places to rent that were under $1,000 a month, which kept up with the cost of living, which made our city affordable. Right now, what we're seeing is the inverse of that, though. There's less than 10% of housing inventory in the Phoenix metro area where someone can find a unit for less than $1,000 a month. And this is also translated into widespread statewide housing burden, being financially insecure from your housing, that you're spending 30% of your income on it. You qualify for being house burdened. And so you can see there that in all of these counties statewide, more than 40% of renters are currently house burdened because of the cost of rent in their area. Go ahead, Kirin. Did you take over this one?
Oh, this is just more, how the home prices have increased over time. You can see a couple of small dips, but the trend over time is big increases.
And what that has meant from, us in Arizona, you can see right there, within a short time period between 2019, we lost a significant amount of purchasing power for home ownership. We went from being a very affordable state where 65% of Phoenix residents could afford to buy a home, and within 3 years, 2 years into the pandemic, only 18%. This has gone up a little bit as more supply came on late 2023 and early 2024, but we're still back to those, under 25% of our Phoenix residents can afford to buy a home. And so what we're also looking at right now is what's happening today in the housing crisis is going to have long-lasting effects for our city state and for Arizonans. We're looking at, if you were able to buy a home pre-pandemic, you have seen, 200,000 plus equity gain. You're sitting a lot of equity in your home, and that's causing a lot of people to continue to sit on it. But we're also seeing is there's, a peak of almost 50% of 18 to 29-year-olds are still living with their parents because housing prices are keeping them out of the market from renting or buying. We're also seeing a backward slide in racial and economic inequality, where white homeowners continue to be the majority of people who are able to purchase and own homes, and Black home ownership continues to slide backwards now because of these pricing inequalities. And we're seeing our lower income areas, marginalized communities, they've been the ones that have most hardest hit with evictions and also price increases. And those communities are the ones that are also most susceptible because they don't have the availability or accessibility to move as easily as other areas. And so what's happening with this crisis is not just this year and next year, but it's creating long-lasting ripple effects along age and race and economic inequalities that will continue to be felt. Also, looking at the state from an economic level, you can see some of the data here. This is not just a point in time where prices are high and it's hard to find somewhere to live. This has vast, widespread, and deeply rooted financial impacts for our state. As people are spending more of their income to stay housed, they're not pursuing better jobs, they're not pursuing better educational opportunities, they're not spending dollars in their community, they're not doing as many things with their families, and so that will continue to be lost revenue on the state as we're not seeing those gains from our community and individual levels, and it'll affect everyone's bottom line, whether they're able to afford a home or not. It's going to impact us all across the board in the state, and you can see that in the numbers. And mobility is being reversed. So instead of everyone moving up the ladder of renting an apartment and buying a starter home and then buying a forever home, now people are just clinging onto that ladder trying to stay housed or moving backwards down it. And the shortage is affecting all types of housing and all income levels. We have a shortage across the board. What we've seen for the unsheltered population, which is tragic, is that those on fixed income have been sliding fast into there. And we're working with a lot of seniors who are first-time homeless, finding themselves on a 5,000 wait list to get housing with no opportunity to be able to feel like they have the security that they once had staying in their homes. So let's talk about why the housing market is broken, Kirin. We have a perfect storm of a lot of different variables, which you can see here. All of these things combined together. We are not unique in Arizona experiencing a housing crisis, but we do have unique variables that not a lot of states have. And I won't go through them all here for sake of time, but you can see the number of factors creating this crisis. But there's two things on here that we can control. We can't control demand. We're trying to control investor-owned properties, economic development. The two things we can control are the regulatory barriers and addressing supply by bringing new housing online.
Yeah, and these things, so first of all, there's only a few things that can be addressed by policy very easily at all, and then even fewer that can be addressed at the state and the local level. But it is worth noting that addressing the two that are circled here actually do help with some of the other ones. So, for example, one of the reasons that there's so much investor activity in the housing market is because when there's a shortage and prices are high, it makes it a lucrative investment. So let's talk about what our kind of current regulatory framework is and how we got here. So this is one of my favorite examples because it really just kind of illustrates the situation that we're in and how absurd it is, in my opinion. So this is an example from probably my favorite book on housing. It's the Strong Towns housing book, Escaping the Housing Trap. So Somerville, Massachusetts is a suburb of Boston. So, one of those cute East Coast towns, super desirable. It's walkable. There's lots of homes listed for over $1 million. Like there's clearly a lot of demand for this place. And in 2015, the city of Somerville decided to do a study to see which of the city's existing residential properties were in compliance with their current zoning code. Meaning that if someone wanted to build that neighborhood or that house today, would they be allowed to? And the city has a population of around 80,000 people. And that in that entire city of 80,000 people, the city identified only 22 residential lots that were in compliance with the current zoning code. And so this is one of my favorite quotes that basically the city had declared itself illegal. And there wasn't just one reason for it. It was the combination of all these requirements and rules about different types of a building and density and lot size. And the result was that almost every property was out of compliance. And, the existing properties could be non-conforming and continue to exist as long as they didn't go through too many alterations, but you couldn't build new neighborhoods like that, which is part of the reason that places like this end up so expensive because there's so much unmet demand. So how did we get into such an absurd situation? I think it's useful to look at a little bit of history. So this is sort of a little illustration of how cities used to grow. So through most of history, what would happen is people would build a house. And actually, before World War II, oftentimes it was people building their own houses, and they might build kind of a shack. And then as they made more money and as the neighborhood grew, they'd tear it down and build more of a house. And the neighborhood would build infrastructure around it. And one of the cool things that you would see in patterns of cities pre-zoning is that, you might start with a neighborhood that's sort of single family homes, but then people move there and the land becomes more valuable because it's desirable. And so it kind of naturally goes through this process of maybe you split up a house into a little duplex, or you add another story, or you kind of, to use Strongtown's language, the neighborhood thickens over time and becomes kind of this ecosystem of sort of diverse human activity where there's this mechanism to add more homes over time. And we're now in this situation where we have just completely short-circuited that process. And so we have basically made it illegal to have that mechanism for growth built into the system. So one modern example that I like to use is my house is one of those kind of classic 1950s Phoenix ranch houses. And it was turned from orange grove into a single family neighborhood, back when the area was mostly fairly rural in 1956. I forget what the population of Phoenix was at the time, but I'd want to say it was, well below 1 million. And now I live in what's considered Central Phoenix, one of the, in the central city of the 5th largest city in the United States. And up until recently, there was actually no mechanism to add more homes to that area. So we've kind of short-circuited this process. So this transition has happened pretty recently. And we went over the last century or so from building in that kind of more organic way that I mentioned before to this highly regulated environment. And it's worth mentioning that it's not all bad. For example, there used to be, if you ever go to like an old museum or a building, I always laugh that like, you see a plaque and it's always like, and then the building burned down in 1865, and then it burned down again. And I forget the exact data, but like it actually is true that fire deaths have actually decreased considerably. And there were situations when people were living in tenement homes that were not great conditions. So there certainly is some well-meaning aspect to it and some good things that came out of it. But in my opinion, I would argue that we've gone well overboard with regard to zoning and building codes. And there is quite a bit of history that is not so great. And so I should actually step back for a moment. I'm kind of assuming that because you are all at a UPP webinar that you're familiar with zoning, but for anybody who's not, it's just the main set of laws related to land use that dictate what can be built where, what activities can take place, and where buildings can be placed on a lot, all of that kind of thing. So zoning started basically kind of in the early 1900s. And, as I said, there are some good aspects to it, but there's also a dark history of race and class segregation. So this is a poster from a 1916 campaign in St. Louis to encouraging voters to adopt racial zoning. So zoning codes actually used to say Black people cannot live in this neighborhood. The courts actually struck down that kind of explicit racial zoning pretty quickly, but to this day, sort of class segregation is very commonplace through things like controlling where multifamily housing can be, or where the minimum lot size is for different areas. It's very much intentionally or unintentionally, certainly comes from a history of intentional class segregation in many cases. And in so another interesting thing about the history of zoning is that it wasn't really this like local grassroots thing that just emerged from city governments. Some of the very first zoning laws did start at the city level. But then the federal government actually created model legislation, and then the federal government heavily incentivized states and cities to adopt zoning codes. So it really was much more top down than I think a lot of people realize. And then a lot of the history is actually even more recent than that. So, this is looking at the early parts of the 1900s. But even most houses that were built 50 years ago or 30 years ago are actually illegal to build today. So, for example, one aspect of zoning is a design review and design standards. So that's things like, not your sort of substantive building code, which looks at sort of the health and safety, but more of these like aesthetics and subjective preferences. Like things like, oh, you have to have a garage and you can't have a carport, or in some places even that they have to approve of the paint colors that people want to paint their homes. So Phoenix actually didn't adopt design review for single family homes until the 90s. So, this is not, when we talk in a few moments about legislation, this is not some kind of radical experiment or some new thing. We're just trying to get back to what was the case really not that long ago. And then, of course, the history of zoning is highly tied into the cultural aspects of, kind of promoting the nuclear family. And so, here's your sort of 1950s suburban imagery. So where we've ended up is that in most major cities in Arizona and throughout the United States, about 75% of residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family homes. As we'll talk in a moment, there's been some movement in this area with the legalization of accessory dwelling units, but there's a couple of problems with having this much land reserved solely for single-family homes. So going back to kind of the first problem with it is just sort of this idea of mechanisms for growth. So instead of letting cities kind of naturally grow and thicken over time, we've locked away 75% of our land and said, you can't build any more homes here. This area has to basically stay rural like it was in 1956. That leaves only a couple of options for how a city can grow. So one is sprawl, where you just keep adding more large lot single family on the edges of town further and further away. And the other is creating multifamily housing in the few areas that aren't zoned for single family housing. And there's a couple problems with that because one is that oftentimes apartments are only available for rent, so it's harder to own. And historically, actually, multifamily housing has actually been deliberately used as a buffer between single family homes and less desirable uses. So oftentimes, if you drive around, you'll notice that apartments are placed on arterial roads, whereas houses are placed in nice neighborhoods next to a park or a school. And then the other problem is just that there's a scarcity of land that's zoned to allow for multifamily housing. And so that creates this weird binary where you have these low density houses and then these higher density apartments and very little in between. And you have this artificial scarcity of land that actually causes the land value to rise and then causes this rental housing to be more expensive than it would be if we were allowed to kind of build in more places. So I need to hurry through because we're already at 10:36. But I wanted to talk about some of the details of how specific we get with some of these regulations. So going back to single family for a moment, cities will set requirements related to everything about where you place the house on the property. One piece of it is minimum lot sizes. So the way that I like to think about it is that it's perfectly legal for me to rent a 400 square foot studio apartment or a 700 square foot one bedroom apartment, but it's actually not legal almost anywhere to live in a house that's that same size, especially if I want to have a small yard. And again, this just kind of limits choices of if maybe you want to have a garden or more windows or privacy, or maybe that's all that you can afford, but you want to have the opportunity to be a homeowner. When cities have different minimum lot sizes for different areas, that leads to this uniformity and this socioeconomic segregation. And then here's just an example of multifamily housing, on an arterial road. And then I haven't had time to go into a ton of the details of other kinds of requirements, but there's also tons of other details of what zoning codes regulate. So one example that I'm weirdly passionate about is walls. So oftentimes zoning codes will require a wall, not just between a residential and a commercial area, but between multifamily and single family, or two different types of commercial. And so that's one of the reasons that, like, in the newer cities like Phoenix, you don't see townhomes or apartments just kind of integrated into the neighborhood, that it's usually walled off into an apartment complex. And in addition to just kind of the feel and the character, it makes it very hard to walk places. So how can we fix this situation that we've gotten ourselves into? Sarah will talk big picture for a minute, and then I'll quickly talk about some kind of specific legislation, and then we can have some discussion.
Yeah, so very, briefly, if you can, look at this slide, I describe it as everything everywhere all at once. We have, we talked about a shortage in housing across the spectrum, and there's no one solution, one piece of policy that's going to address this crisis. So we need to be building more supply, and then we also need to be funding. We need to have community support. We need to be creatively building. We need to look at regulatory reform. We need to look at eviction prevention. So these are a lot of the things we're doing from, where I am at, my purview in the legislature. I know cities are doing some of this, like communities are doing this as well. We just need to be making sure we're supporting and pushing forward these solutions, because it's going to take, a very broad spectrum of solutions in order to really address this crisis.
And just one quick piece on subsidized housing specifically. I think that there's always going to be some percentage of the population that needs assistance to have access to housing for whatever reason. And reasonable people can disagree about how much assistance to provide or what that looks like. But the way that I like to think about it is that that's a separate issue from zoning reform. And that zoning reform is needed regardless of whether you're talking about the private market paying for housing or you're talking about government assistance, because we still need to legalize the types of housing that are affordable and meet people's needs. But then another important point is that we're in a position now where we cannot subsidize our way out of this crisis. So when it's not just your truly poor who are struggling, but it's your middle class, there's simply not enough money, at least not within our, kind of current economic paradigm, to solve this problem by throwing money at it. We have to actually get to some of the root causes of why the regular housing market is not working. And then also just philosophically, I personally believe that people should have a right to build a life for themselves and be allowed to participate in the economy. And that while government assistance is great, it should not be used as kind of a consolation prize for excluding people from the regular economy. So in terms of zoning reform, it's actually something that there's been a surprising amount of agreement from organizations like all over the political spectrum on. These are just some organizations who have weighed in on zoning reform in some way. And if you look at the request to speak system in Arizona on our bills, it's a huge coalition of groups on all sides of the aisle in support. And then in opposition, it's usually pretty much just the League of Cities and Towns, individual cities, and then some neighborhood groups. So in terms of specific solutions, we want to increase options. I am not going to go into depth about kind of like the more broad solutions, because I want to zero in on some specific legislation. But one important piece is legalizing more homes in all neighborhoods, and not just, hey, we want to allow more density in specific places, because then that lets people into those desirable areas, spreads growth out throughout cities, and kind of just allows for more of that kind of organic growth. I'm going to skip over this slide about why statewide rather than purely local change, but if folks have questions about this, I can come back to it during the Q&A. So the good news is that there has been some really wonderful movement on this in Arizona. So during the 2024 legislative session, there were 2 bills signed by the governor that were championed by Arizona Neighborhood Project, and Sarah Ligouri being a huge champion in the legislature, part of our coalition. One now legalizes 2 accessory dwelling units, that's like a guest house, per single family lot in the larger cities throughout Arizona. And then the other legalizes fourplex on single family lots near downtown areas in the larger cities. But our kind of headliner bill, which is back this year, was actually vetoed by the governor. We were pretty devastated by it, but it's back this year, and it actually passed the Senate a couple days ago. So we're excited. And so basically the Arizona Starter Homes Act re-legalizes the types of housing that our parents and grandparents grew up in, the starter home. And it does this through a couple of ways. One is there's actually this HOA piece where it prevents cities from requiring like shared amenities that would require an expensive HOA to maintain. It prevents cities from the actual technical requirements and language of the bill are more technical than this, but in effect, it prevents cities from making it illegal to have a small house or requiring all houses to have a big yard. And for new subdivisions, it prevents cities from requiring a minimum lot size above 3,000 square feet. And it prevents requirements that residential property owners put a wall around their property, and then makes it so that cities can't have requirements related to the aesthetics and subjective preferences related to kind of design and that kind of stuff. So here's just an example on the left of like a typical Phoenix house that is, wouldn't be legal to build today. And then on the right, this is actually a picture from Atlanta of, what starter homes might look like with kind of a more modern style of architecture. And then here's just a little teaser of it has been a wild ride, as Nicole and Sarah can attest, of ups and downs at the legislature. I like to show this slide because last year there were actual propaganda posters circulating on social media about the Starter Homes Act. So the Starter Homes Act actually only deals with single family homes. And you can see from these pictures that, that there's some very misleading claims in the propaganda posters. So I will stop there. I went 4 minutes above our goal for Q&A.
Yeah, we do have a question. Let's see, we got one from Rocky. And thank you, Rocky. I love the comment. So with question about single stair case policies, and I did drop some messages, or excuse me, links in the chat for folks who want to learn more about that. But Kirin or Sarah, your personal opinions, if you have any yet, on single stair zoning reform, or it's not reforming for single stairs, it's to actually allow single stair development. If you have any ideas or opinions on that you would like to share.
I haven't seen legislation yet in Arizona, but I'm sure it may be something that's on the radar of Kirin to.
Yeah, so this seems to be a informed group that many of you are probably as nerdy as Sarah and I. But for anybody who's not familiar, single stair refers to an aspect of American building codes that basically in apartments, the building code requires that each apartment unit have access to 2 stairwells, and it's kind of a fire safety requirement. But it has this, so it sounds sort of boring and technical, but it has huge implications for the types of buildings that can be built. So if you think about, like, if you've ever been to like Europe or Asia, and you go to those cute little European towns that they might actually be the same density, for example, as like a mid-rise apartment here, but like maybe a 4-story buildings, but they're narrow and they each have like their own little door right down to the street. And if you ever stayed at someone's house in a European city, oftentimes it's a very broad, Europe is a big place, but the person who actually came up with single stair reform is actually from my very favorite city in the world of Freiburg, Germany. And you'll notice that apartments in a lot of other places are much more livable. So they'll have more windows to the outside and more family-sized units and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas apartments here tend to, particularly the newly built ones, tend to kind of take up an entire block. And I like to describe them as neither walkable nor drivable, because you have to walk for like 10 minutes just to get out of the building down to the street, as opposed to those nice narrow buildings of a similar density. So single stair reform there's a movement in a couple places in the US to reform building codes to allow closer to the European standard where you only need one stairwell, which would then allow those types of buildings. It also decreases costs because the cost of having the second stairwell is very expensive, but then it addresses some of those issues, makes it easier to have family sized units because then the layout of the building is such that like you have more space to work with and more units that are able to have windows and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm a big fan of single stair reform. I didn't have a chance to read it yet, but I saw the headline. There was a big report that was put out, I think it was by Pew this week, where there was a study looking at kind of comparing the fire safety of single versus double stair and concluding that there weren't any safety issues with single stair reform. As far as specific legislation in Arizona, it's not something that we have pursued at the state level. I do know that Flagstaff it has talked about it, and it's definitely something that I'm long-term very interested in.
Yeah, and I was really excited to also hear about Flagstaff potentially going in that direction. Or now actually next in line, Stephen, if you want to go ahead. Thanks.
I just wanted to sort of start by saying, like, I really like the idea, Representative Ligouri, of like the idea of everything, everywhere, all at once. Just because, like, I think from a policy perspective, it allows policy to be flexible, both just like in terms of the sheer nature of the housing crisis, but also politically, especially in the state legislature. I think the starter bill is a good bill. I think one of the questions I have, I think for either of you working in this arena, especially at the state level, is what's the progress that you're seeing being made in terms of convincing like a bipartisan consensus on even more housing issues? I guess a little aspect to that is like, are you finding sort of the messaging around that to be maybe a little bit more different? Like, I know the idea of freedom on this issue is a good sort of talking point to that.
That's a great question. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Housing is bipartisan, but it can also be divisive. But it's been a really great place that I've enjoyed working from because we get to talk about our neighbors, our communities, and everyone at this point can relate to having a parent that, might need housing in the near future, or a child or a grandchild or a neighbor or someone. So it's so relatable statewide in every district and to every person because the crisis is so bad. And then on the other side of that, we're seeing a lot of the dark side of this where you have colleagues of mine saying, well, we don't want those people living near us and we don't want poor people being in our neighborhood. We're more concerned about our property values. And so on one hand, it's been really great to see the strong bipartisan alignment because it is a top statewide issue. And so that housing affordability, I would bet money on, is a top 3 issue in everyone's district around the state. So it is something we have to come together on, and it is things we're looking at, like the low income housing tax credit extension, funding the housing trust fund, doing some of these zoning reform ideas. There's a plethora of ideas that we're working on. So it's brought a lot of coalitions together, which is very empowering. And then it's also facilitated areas of kind of tougher discussions where we need to have let's unpack this a little bit, like Kirin did in her presentation, and go back to looking at the history and how we got here, to understanding what zoning really does and where we might have some availability to make it work better for our communities where we are presently. And Kirin, I don't know if you have anything to add because you're in on those conversations deeply too.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating issue to work on because it's one of the most bipartisan issues. Like, the support and the opposition are both quite bipartisan. For the most part, we have found messaging that is able to resonate with both sides of the aisle. So our organization also has, in addition to myself, we contract with both a Republican and a Democrat lobbyist, and they help to kind of guide us in what language that we use that might unintentionally be loaded with one side or the other, and try to use things that are unifying. So for the most part, partisan divide has not been the problem. It's been more of folks who are sensitive to the League of Cities and Towns and their mayors. There have been a couple of adventures in terms of messaging we've tried that has just horribly backfired. So we tried briefly some messaging related to private property and found that even though the bills themselves would, do some things that I think a lot of Democrats would be very on board with, we kind of framed the messaging around private property rights. And we found that Democrats absolutely hated it and couldn't get past the messaging. So that's kind of the main misadventure. We learned a couple of lessons like that, but otherwise folks have been unified. And a lot of the credit is to the legislators, because we have legislators on both sides of the aisle who are so committed to this issue and really put politics aside to work together.
And I got one question here for y'all, and for like a 1-minute response, if you can, from Max, and then I'll do a closing message to everyone. He's asking, the housing research literature is showing there is a policy trade-off where statewide zoning reform could increase housing supply, but local control would make reform more politically feasible with less pushback and buy-in from residents. Has there been discussions where things like local opt-out mechanisms for residents could be put in place with state reforms or something similar? A blend between state preemption reform, but also giving some options for neighbors to decide opt-in or opt out of certain preemptive zoning programs. He posted that in the chat, and I'm sorry that's hard to do and respond within a minute, but Kirin, if you want to, because your audio is coming through really clear.
Sure. Yeah, that's a hard question to quickly respond to. So I haven't read the literature that you're referring to. It's interesting that you would say the politics are easier at the city level. In my experience, the politics have been easier at the state level for a number of reasons. There have been conversations, and in some cases, jurisdictions that have used those sorts of opt-outs as kind of a political compromise. One example that comes to mind is Houston, which doesn't have traditional zoning. The kind of compromise that's kept that politically viable is they have, I'm completely blanking on the mechanism. It might just be regular kind of deed restrictions where, individual neighborhoods can decide to make an agreement to limit things in a certain way. And then I think something like 20 or 25% of neighborhoods do that. And then that's how they prevent having zoning. There's a number of reasons I don't love it from a policy perspective, but politically it's a compromise that can work. And one reason I'm open to it as a political compromise is that sort of thing can at least kind of shift something from opt-in to opt-out. So let's say you have like a preemptive statewide bill that requires something of cities, and then you have, say, like opt-out language where like if a neighborhood gets a certain number of signatures from people in the area, they can create like a character preservation district. It kind of shifts the burden to, okay, the default is going to be more permissive, and then the folks who want to band together and do something more restrictive come together to make that change, which is a flip from the current situation, right, where it's the default is more restrictive and you have to put in a bunch of effort to try and be more permissive. So I would love to answer your question in more detail, but it is 11 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of time.
No, thank you. That was really great. And Max, thanks for the reference to that study in the chat. So just wanted to close out because I know everyone's very busy, and I would love to just extend my gratitude to all of you for joining us today and engaging in the conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you very much to Kirin Goff and State Representative Sarah Ligouri for sharing your perspectives and policy solutions and data. Lastly, this discussion is made possible by donations to help support further conversations like this. So if you could give a donation today or anytime in the future. And with that, I want to thank you all once again for being a part of today's discussion. And let's continue working together to build a better housing future for Arizona, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, UPP.